It's the 15-foot mystery, moving slowly and methodically through Alaska's freezing water. Locals asking if this is Alaska's own version of the Loch Ness Monster.
What if the world's most terrifying lake monster was never a legend, but a scientific discovery waiting to happen? For centuries, witnesses have described a gigantic creature lurking beneath the freezing waters of Alaska's mysterious Lake Iliamna. Most people laughed it off as folklore. Scientists were certain they would finally prove the myth was false. But the moment their deep-water DNA analysis came back, everything changed. Hidden more than 1,200 feet beneath the surface of one of the deepest and most isolated lakes in North America, researchers uncovered genetic evidence that should not exist. It didn't belong to salmon. It didn't belong to seals. It didn't match whales, sharks, or any known species ever documented by science. At first, they dismissed it as contaminated data. They reran the tests. Then another laboratory repeated the analysis using completely different samples collected weeks later. The result was exactly the same. Whatever was living beneath Lake Iliamna was far larger and far stranger than anyone had imagined. Now scientists are facing a question they never expected to ask. What if the legend was real all along? Stay with us until the very end, because the evidence you're about to see has left researchers shocked, and what may be hiding in the darkest depths of Lake Iliamna could completely rewrite everything we thought we knew about this mysterious lake.
Lake Iliamna is anything but peaceful. And according to their stories, their warnings, and their centuries of accumulated knowledge, it is home to something that is killed.
Before we reveal the chilling discovery, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next. The trail of evidence you're about to see leads somewhere almost impossible to believe. What started as a standard environmental DNA study soon evolved into one of the most baffling scientific investigations of the modern era. Researchers collected samples from nearly 600 feet beneath the surface of an isolated Alaskan lake, a place where sunlight never penetrates and few humans have ever ventured. What they discovered changed everything. Every laboratory reached the same unsettling conclusion. The genetic material belonged to a massive living creature unlike anything recorded in any known DNA database on Earth. As the findings spread, 3 separate research teams, each pursuing entirely different scientific goals, independently focused on the exact same section of the lake. They were no longer investigating an old legend. They were following real scientific evidence, and that evidence led them directly toward a mystery that had lingered in Alaska for generations. Long before advanced laboratories and genetic testing existed, Indigenous communities spoke of a gigantic presence hidden beneath these waters. Through the years, fishermen disappeared without explanation. Veteran bush pilots reported enormous shadows moving below the surface, and one of the most famous incidents involved 17 eyewitnesses who claimed they watched a colossal creature emerge from the lake in broad daylight. Even a $100,000 reward failed to uncover the truth. Critics dismissed the stories as myths, and most scientists remained unconvinced. Yet after years of repeated testing, independent verification, and ruling out every conventional explanation, researchers found themselves using a word they never imagined would apply here: population. This is the extraordinary mystery of Lake Iliamna. And once you examine the evidence for yourself, you'll understand why those determined to debunk Alaska's legendary lake monster ultimately became far more unsettled by the facts than by the folklore. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand the lake itself. Lake Iliamna is the largest lake in Alaska, but calling it simply a lake hardly captures its true scale. Depending on the shoreline measurement, it stretches roughly 77 miles in length and reaches about 22 miles across at its widest point. Imagine placing an entire major city with all of its buildings, roads, and neighborhoods into the middle of this body of water. Even then, vast stretches of open lake would surround it in every direction. Very few people live here. Only a handful of small villages are scattered along the shoreline, and no highways connect them to the outside world. Reaching most areas requires traveling by bush plane, landing either on remote gravel airstrips or directly on the lake itself. Beyond those isolated settlements lies one of North America's last great wildernesses, an endless landscape of tundra, rivers, forests, and mountains, where it's possible to spin in a complete circle without seeing a single sign of human construction. Then there's the lake's incredible depth. In certain areas, the bottom plunges beyond 1,000 feet. That's more than 1,000 feet of icy freshwater resting deep inland, separated from the ocean by winding rivers and rugged mountain ranges. Vast portions of the lake bed have never been seen by human eyes. Until recently, technology simply wasn't capable of exploring those hidden depths. In fact, scientists possess more detailed maps of some lunar craters than they do of the floor of Lake Iliamna. The lake itself is also brutally unforgiving. Even during Alaska's short summer, the water remains cold enough to become deadly within minutes. In the deepest sections, temperatures stay only slightly above freezing. Anyone entering those waters without proper protection has very little time before hypothermia becomes life-threatening. Yet according to families who have lived and fished here for generations, freezing water has never been the lake's greatest danger. For countless generations, the Alutiiq people and neighboring indigenous communities have spoken of a massive creature inhabiting these waters. These stories were never meant as bedtime tales to frighten children. Instead, they were passed down as practical survival lessons, taught with the same seriousness as warnings about fire or dangerous currents. Different cultures gave the creature different names, and that detail is especially striking. When multiple unrelated communities preserve nearly identical traditions without influencing one another, it often suggests they were all responding to the same unexplained reality. Their warning remained remarkably consistent across generations. If the lake suddenly behaves in ways that don't make sense, if the surface begins moving against the wind or something about the water feels deeply wrong, you leave immediately. You don't paddle closer. You don't investigate. You head for shore without hesitation. Rules this precise aren't created for entertainment. They're usually born from painful experience. At some point in the distant past, someone ignored that warning and never returned. The memory of that loss survived by becoming part of the culture itself. When Russian fur traders entered the region during the 1700s in search of valuable sea otter and seal pelts, they heard these warnings from local communities. Like many outsiders before them, they dismissed the stories as superstition, assuming they reflected nothing more than fear of the unknown. But their own journals tell a different story. Later entries, written by practical businessmen interested in trade rather than folklore, describe boats being struck from beneath by something they could never identify. Some accounts mention men thrown into the water despite calm conditions. Others describe vessels suddenly lifting on one side, as though an enormous object had risen directly underneath them before disappearing without leaving a trace. By the final years of their expeditions, many of those same traders reportedly avoided certain areas of the lake altogether. They even kept loaded muskets close at hand, not because they feared bears along the shoreline, but because of something hidden beneath the water that none of them could explain and none of them wanted to encounter. To many outsiders, those warnings were simply the fears of people who, they believed, didn't understand the natural world the way educated explorers did. But the traders' own written records reveal how quickly that confidence began to fade. In journals kept by men whose lives revolved around commerce rather than storytelling, strange incidents started appearing. These weren't dramatic legends or exaggerated campfire tales. They were straightforward accounts describing boats being struck from below by something no one ever saw. Crew members were thrown overboard even when the water was perfectly calm. One report described an entire vessel suddenly rising on one side as though an immense force had lifted it from beneath, only for the lake to become completely still moments later, leaving no trace behind. As the years passed, those same traders reportedly began steering well clear of certain areas of Lake Iliamna. They also kept loaded muskets within easy reach, not because they expected trouble from bears on shore, but because of something hidden beneath the water that they could neither identify nor explain. For nearly 2 centuries, that's where the story remained. Every warning was dismissed by outsiders as another local myth, while the people who actually depended on the lake for survival quietly continued to respect it. Then, in 1942, the legend encountered something it had never faced before: highly credible eyewitnesses whose testimony couldn't be dismissed so easily. To understand why this particular sighting became so important, you first need to know who the witnesses were. The first was an experienced bush pilot. In Alaska's remote wilderness, a bush pilot survives by reading the landscape with absolute precision. His vision wasn't just useful, it was essential. Every flight depended on recognizing safe landing areas, interpreting terrain, and spotting changing weather long before it arrived. He constantly studied rivers, mountains, and the surface of the water itself, and countless subtle details that determined whether he landed safely or never landed at all. The second witness was a wildlife officer whose career depended on identifying animals accurately. Distinguishing one species from another wasn't a casual skill, it was the foundation of his profession. Someone with that level of training doesn't mistake one animal for another. Years of experience had taught him to recognize wildlife without guesswork. Neither man had any interest in promoting unbelievable stories. They had nothing to gain by claiming they had seen something impossible. In fact, within Alaska's close-knit aviation community, developing a reputation for imagining things could quietly destroy a career built over many years. Yet during that flight, as they crossed the lake at low altitude, both men noticed movement beneath the surface. It wasn't a single object. It wasn't an optical illusion or a shadow cast by the changing light. They counted more than a dozen enormous shapes traveling below the water. Each one appeared to be roughly as long as the wingspan of their aircraft. Imagine looking down from your plane and realizing the creatures beneath you are nearly the same length as the wings carrying you through the sky. Even more remarkable was the way they moved. They weren't drifting randomly like floating debris or scattering in different directions like feeding fish. Instead, they traveled together with remarkable coordination, maintaining a loose formation as though every movement was intentional. It looked less like a collection of individual animals and more like a group following the same destination. Both witnesses also noticed an unusual metallic shimmer reflecting across the backs of the creatures whenever sunlight touched the surface. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, The formation disappeared into the depths. The water settled. Within moments, Lake Iliamna looked perfectly ordinary again. After landing, neither man rushed to newspapers or searched for publicity. They simply reported exactly what they had observed to people they trusted. Their account wasn't filled with dramatic claims or exaggerated language. Instead, it carried the unmistakable tone of two professionals describing something they genuinely couldn't explain. That single event changed everything. Before 1942, most people who claimed to have seen something unusual in the lake remained silent, knowing how easily they would be ridiculed. The social cost of speaking openly often felt greater than keeping the experience to themselves, but when respected professionals with impeccable reputations described nearly identical observations, others began finding the confidence to come forward. And once those first credible reports surfaced, the sightings didn't stop. They continued appearing decade after decade, reported by pilots, outdoorsmen, and experienced observers who had little to gain and plenty to lose by making such extraordinary claims. One of the most discussed cases came in 1977, when pilot Tim Lefior was flying a routine route over Lake Iliamna. It was a familiar journey he had completed countless times. The weather was calm, and the afternoon sun reflected brightly across the water. Without warning, two enormous dark shapes slowly rose toward the surface. The movement wasn't sudden or frantic. Instead, it was deliberate and controlled, a sight Lefior later admitted he could never forget. He estimated each creature measured nearly 30 feet in length, longer than the small airplane he was flying. Their backs formed a series of rounded humps that briefly broke the surface before disappearing again, creating an image remarkably similar to classic illustrations of giant sea serpents. The obvious explanation came almost immediately. Whales, large dark bodies moving through cold northern waters, certainly fit that description, and for many people, the answer seemed simple enough. But Lefior rejected that conclusion for one important reason. Lake Iliamna isn't connected to the open ocean. It's a freshwater lake located roughly 77 miles inland, separated by winding rivers and rugged terrain. Whales simply aren't supposed to exist there. Calling the creatures whales doesn't solve the mystery. It only creates an even bigger question. If they truly were whales, how did they reach the lake? And more importantly, how could they survive there? The moment those questions are asked, the mystery remains exactly where it started. Now compare Lefior's testimony with the reports from the 1942 witnesses, and a fascinating pattern begins to emerge. Different witnesses, different decades, no connection between them, no shared story to influence one another, no opportunity to compare notes. Yet time after time, their accounts point toward the same unsettling conclusion. Think for a moment about what an encounter like that would feel like. Imagine standing in a small boat and sensing something unimaginably large moving beneath you. You don't see it with your eyes. You feel its size through the wooden hull beneath your feet. In an instant, you realize whatever just passed below is far larger than the boat keeping you afloat. That kind of fear isn't something a camera can capture. It's the sort of experience that stays with a person for the rest of their life. Then came 1988, a sighting that remains one of the strongest challenges to skeptical explanations. This wasn't a lone pilot flying overhead, or a single fisherman recalling an isolated experience. This time, an entire group of people witnessed the same event together. A crowd had gathered along the shoreline, looking out across the lake. Roughly 200 yards from shore, the calm surface suddenly broke. Not once. Several enormous shapes surfaced almost simultaneously. Everyone standing there saw it happen. Official reports recorded 17 eyewitnesses that day, 17 people watching the exact same section of water at the exact same moment. Now apply every common skeptical explanation to that number. One person can mistake floating debris for an animal. Two people might unintentionally influence each other's memories. But 17 independent witnesses observing the same event at the same time is something entirely different. At that point, you're no longer dealing with a simple misunderstanding or an individual illusion. You're left with one unavoidable question. What did they actually see? By the late 1980s, the growing collection of eyewitness reports had become increasingly difficult to dismiss with laughter alone. As more credible accounts accumulated, curiosity gave way to serious investigation and eventually significant financial backing. Years earlier, in 1979, a newspaper had offered a $100,000 reward to anyone capable of providing undeniable proof. A crystal-clear photograph, physical remains, a body, anything that could settle the mystery once and for all. Those pursuing the reward weren't chasing campfire stories. They arrived equipped with sonar systems, underwater microphones, and submersible technology designed to explore places no diver could safely reach. They surveyed sections of the lake bed. They lowered scientific instruments through the thermocline into water hovering just above freezing. Night after night, they listened to the darkness beneath the surface. The reward was never claimed. No body floated ashore. No photograph emerged that convinced every skeptic. By the official standards of the challenge, the expedition had failed. But failing to prove the legend wasn't the same as proving nothing existed, because the instruments recorded something investigators couldn't fully explain. Sonar repeatedly detected massive moving targets at depths where no known animal in Lake Iliamna should have been traveling. Hydrophones captured deep, unfamiliar sounds unlike any documented call from recognized freshwater species. These weren't stories passed around a campfire. They were measurements collected by scientific equipment. Again and again, those instruments revealed large moving objects deep beneath the lake, objects no one aboard could confidently identify. Then another category of evidence began to appear, evidence that remained long after the encounter itself had ended. Commercial fishermen occasionally recovered nets that hadn't simply become tangled or worn out. Instead, they had been sliced apart with remarkable force, severing heavy lines designed to support enormous catches of salmon. Some boats returned to shore, carrying deep, parallel grooves carved into their hulls beneath the waterline. Everything changed when modern science returned to Lake Iliamna with technology far beyond anything available decades ago. Deepwater DNA samples, unexplained thermal signatures, and unusual seismic patterns all pointed to the same remote section of the lake. None of the teams set out to prove a legend, but together, their findings suggested something astonishing. Not a single unknown creature, but possibly an entire hidden population. Whether it's an undiscovered species or another explanation entirely, one thing is certain. The mystery of Lake Iliamna is far from over. What do you think is really hiding beneath its dark waters? Let us know in the comments.